Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks from Braintree High School, and today we have a screencast on the Watergate crisis. So, without any further ado, let's talk about it. That, of course, is our guy, Richard Nixon. He's not going to have his best week, month, or year during this time period. It's a long journey. So, why don't we start the story on June 17th, 1967? That's even before Nixon became president. So, like all stories, we have a beginning, and we'll start with Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under President Johnson. Well, he's at the end of a very unpopular Vietnam War, at least his end of it, and he decides to create a study. He says, you know what? We got to study the Vietnam War and all the mistakes we made so we can learn from it and do better in the future. Sounds like a good idea. So they do a massive study, and they investigate all their mistakes. And it comes out to this huge document called the Pentagon Papers, thousands of pages. I think it was like 3,000 pages with like 4,000 more documents. It's crazy, the Pentagon Papers. But in the end, when you look at it, it really, really made the government look bad. There was a lot of mistakes and a lot of lies. So Robert McNamara makes it top secret, classified. That's a fancy way of saying nobody gets to see this. Now, the public is not told about it. And Robert McNamara actually steps down pretty close after this. So in a way, he kind of lost his job. So then we have somebody new come in, but either way, the public is not told about these things. And in 1969, a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, he was one of the really, really smart people that worked on the Pentagon Papers. So he had exposure to it and he read it. And he's looking at it, he's like, wow, our government is awful. And people are still dying right now based on this war. If they only knew all the mistakes and the lies, it could end the war. So he basically said, you know what? I think our government is bad. I'm going to sneak in here tonight. I'm going to photocopy all these pages. I actually think it took a lot of nights. And then I'm going to leak it to the press, specifically the Washington Post and later the New York Times. So either way, it gets leaked and the Washington Post starts publishing it. And this makes the country really, really sad and really, really angry. I mean, we're talking lies. This war is awful. How many people have died? And it really stirs the pot. Now, Richard Nixon eventually becomes president during this moment. And he actually at first is like, wow, this makes my predecessors look terrible. This is good. But then it does make the current government look bad too. Because again, the American people are demanding an end to a war that he wants to finish. So in a way, he sees this precedent of allowing leaks to occur is really negative. What if people leak against him, which does happen? So he puts together this group of people of ex-FBI and CIA, calls them the plumbers. Why the plumbers? And here's 5 of them. I think they previously were involved in the the Bay of Pigs invasion and all that for the CIA. So anyway, their job is going to be find Nixon's enemies, figure out who's leaking all these documents, and then punish them essentially. So the first criminal act that the plumbers do is they're going to go after Daniel Ellsberg, the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. They wanted to find out what else he knew, what else he was hiding. They were looking to find information that they could blackmail him on and discredit him. So in the end, they broke into his therapist's office, and they thought that the therapist would know all these secrets and that they would find out. Turns out they really found out nothing, but they still broke in, pretty illegal. Some time goes by, and the 72 presidential election is coming up, and Nixon is nervous. I mean, he lost in 1960 when he thought he was going to win. He lost in 62 when he thought he was going to win. He just barely pulled out the 1968 election. He is nervous. So he's going up against George McGovern. He knows the Vietnam War is not unbelievably popular. So that said, he's nervous. He wants to win this election by a lot. He certainly wants to win it. So one of the plumbers, a guy named G. Gordon Liddy, and now this is, if we're talking Watergate, this is your guy. He's one of the plumbers, but he switches and he leaves the plumbers or does 2 jobs at once and actually joins a more formal, tangible organization. Not so much the plumbers, but the committee to reelect the president. His job is going to be to get Nixon elected. Presidents are too busy to worry about their elections. They have to run the country. So the committee to reelect the president is kind of an acronym, CRP, committee, but a lot of people, put the acronyms CREEP down because they were a bunch of creeps apparently. So anyway, G. Gordon Liddy, former plumber, now working for the committee to reelect the president, comes up with a plan. And the plan is to go after Nixon's enemies to get him reelected. And G. Gordon Liddy, then it goes up to John Dean, he's like White House counsel, the top lawyer, and then John Mitchell, essentially an attorney general, 2 really, really powerful people in the White House. He says, listen, how about I do this, this, and this? And they're like, yeah, do it. Absolutely do it. So they fund CREEP with $250,000. That was a lot of money back then. And the first action that they take, first of many, On May 28th, 1972, they grabbed the plumbers. They've done sketchy things against leaks before, and they now ask the plumbers to break into the the people that run the Democratic Party, because of course Nixon's a Republican. So they're going to break into the Democratic National Committee's offices, which is located at the Watergate Hotel, which I believe is right over the Washington, D.C. line in Virginia. And they break in and they put listening devices all over the place, including the chairman of the Democratic Party. I think his name was Larry O'Brien. So anyway, they tapped both of those phones. And why would they do that? Well, they're going to put a guy named Alfred Baldwin across the street in the Hojos, or Howard Johnson's, which is near Watergate. And he's going to spend that whole time listening to these devices to see if they can find out what the Democrats are up to. What are their tactics? Something they can blackmail them on, or counter their tactics, so that Nixon wins the 72 election. Now, 20 days later, one of the listening devices malfunctions. Baldwin's like, I can't hear anything. So they got to go fix it. So take number 2. On June 17th, 1972, the burglars go back again into the Watergate Hotel. Now, Frank Wills is the security guard after hours there. And he notices somebody has put tape across the spring lock of the door. Now, he noticed in the past that the cleaning people have done that. That way they can open the doors, with their hips or their legs, and they don't have to worry about them locking and so on, because the tape prevents the door from locking. And then when they're done with their duty, they undo the tape. So anyway, Frank Wills sees the tape, and it's after hours. He knows the cleaning crew has gone home, so he takes out the tape. And then he comes back minutes later, and there's more tape on it. He's like, oh, I think somebody's trying to break into this building. Cleaning people aren't doing it, so he calls the police. And the police come in, and they search the building, and they find the burglars who have broken into, the Democrats' office. So they get arrested. And on August 29th, 1972, here's Nixon, because everybody's like, who would want to break into the Democrats' office? It must be the Republicans. So either way, he publicly announces, I can say absolutely nobody on my staff would ever do this and has done this. So that's a denial. And everybody believes Nixon. It's like, whatever. So what happens? If ultimately, this is just one small break-in, nobody was hurt, it wasn't violent, nobody really cares. Nobody's paying attention. People are busy with their own lives. So Nixon seems to be free and clear and safe above all things. However, this is where history intervenes. The Washington Post has 2 young reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And they're like, you know what? Our job of members of the press is to stop the powerful from being abusive. So we're going to look for clues. We're going to figure out who was behind this. Clearly, somebody's behind this. It must be connected to the Republican Party somehow. So the evidence they immediately find, they do a much better job than the police investigating, is they find that the burglars, one of them, Bernard Baker, has a check in his account for $25,000. Laundered a little bit, but it came from CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So they're going to do a lot of investigation. They're going to follow that money, and they're going to find out that that's a connection to the White House. Now, who sent it? Well, they're going to, again, try to find out. And like I said, they'll eventually connect it to the White House. Now, evidence number 2 that Woodward and Bernstein find is they're searching for clues. And one of the burglars, in fact, the security leader, one of the leaders, was a guy named James McCord. In his hotel room at the Watergate, he had an address book. And this is literally his address book right here. And when you look closely in it, which must have been tough, a lot of pages, you see something labeled WH. And that's going to turn out to be a White House number. Why does the guy that broke into the Democrats' office have a connection with somebody at the White House? And if you look closely, they also wrote HH. He's got terrible handwriting. It's kind of weird. That stands for Howard Hunt, which they're going to figure out. Now, Howard Hunt was no longer working for CREEP at the time, but he had been working. So that said, now they have a connection between the burglars and CREEP. And that is a connection to the White House, right? Evidence piece number 3, Woodward and Bernstein over the course of the next couple months just keep looking and looking. And things that they uncover is that CREEP, remember they established a connection to them, had a dirty tricks campaign. They investigated people. They were trying to get Democrats accused of cheating on their wives. They accused some top Democrats of being locked in mental facilities and being crazy. They used the FBI to basically, any reporter that reported negatively on Nixon, to tap them, to get some evidence to blackmail them. The IRS, another national organization, was used by Nixon, or should I say CREEP, to audit somebody that was being negative to Nixon and whatnot, to punish them and so on. So either way, all of that's some way, indirectly or directly, illegal. But they also kept saying, the break-in must be because of them as well. So how did they get all that evidence? Now, Woodward and Bernstein were great, but they weren't that great. Woodward specifically had been traveling to Arlington, Virginia, going into a sketchy parking garage, which is this one of the more famous places in Arlington today, going next to Post 32. And he had 17 meetings over the next year with somebody who was feeding him information about the creep and Nixon in the White House. Now, Nixon, this is going to be a direct connection between Nixon and the burglars and so on, or indirect at that time. So Woodward and Bernstein are going to keep publishing these things, and Nixon's going to keep getting frustrated. He's like, how do they keep finding this stuff out? It's like a slow march to his prison cell, you know. So we don't know who's leaking information, although Nixon had some suspicion. But that source told Woodward, "You cannot tell anybody who I am until after I die," and that's going to be mostly kept. That's his nickname by the colleagues at the Washington Post, since Woodward wouldn't say who it was this guy's deep throat, kind of a sexual pun and whatnot, making fun of Woodward for meeting with somebody that he couldn't reveal. So anyway, January 8th, 1973 comes around. We're into the next year. The Watergate trial begins, and the 5 burglars are on trial, but also Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, 2 people that worked at Creep. Now, how did they get caught? Well, Alfred Baldwin, remember that guy across the street listening? He basically received no instructions when everybody got arrested. So he went straight to the FBI. He was paranoid that he had been disowned by the committee. So he goes to the FBI and he testifies and says, no, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, they were in charge of the burglars. He rats on them. And it basically gets away with everything, right? If you rat first, you get a cut a deal, a pretty sweet deal. So Liddy and Hunt get arrested as the leaders. And now the trial is going on. And Judge Sirica is going to play a pivotal role in the Watergate story now. So a few weeks goes by, the trials go on, and the 5 burglars are found guilty. But Judge Sirica is unhappy because he thinks about it. He's like, there's no way that they did this on their own. Why would they possibly want to break in there? They don't care. So the burglars have kept their mouths shut. So something is going on. Why would they possibly have done this? And who's paying their legal bills? This is massively expensive. These guys aren't rich. So the judge says, I need them to rat on whoever hired them. That's the people that are really bad. So he says, I'm going to give you 40 years in prison for this, which is a massively unfair sentence, trying to pressure them to rat on whoever hired them. It's to get them to start talking. And on March 21st, 1973, at the White House, Nixon knows the judge is putting pressure on them and is worried they're going to rat. So Nixon basically has a conversation with John Dean, who's managing the White House cover-up. And he famously says, John Dean says to Nixon, there's a cancer in the White House. Slowly, these burglars and Hunt and Liddy, they're going to rat. And we were all involved in this, and we knew what was going on, and we knew about the cover-up. And that cancer is going to grow. And we are going to get in trouble. These 2 guys are blackmailing us. They want $1 million to stay quiet, a lot of money back then. And Nixon says, pay them. Definitely pay them. I don't want to go to prison. You don't want to go to prison. Pay them. So they're going to get some campaign funds to pay them. Now, the burglars themselves also had to be kept quiet. And from the beginning, they were paid about $15,000 each to keep quiet. So that said, Nixon had approved that as well. Now, March 23rd, 1973. Now, at this time, remember that Judge Sirica is still pressuring the burglars to talk, and they haven't. But finally, James McCord says, I don't want to go to prison for 40 years. I'm not that loyal to Richard Nixon or Liddy or Hunt or whoever. So anyway, he's under pressure. He never sees his family again. And he finally testifies, reads from a note, there was political pressure applied to us to plead guilty and remain silent. So that just blew the country's mind. That was confirmation that somebody was behind it. They still wouldn't say who it was. And is there a connection to the White House? There must be a connection to the White House. So the judge, we thank you for this, because if he did not apply that pressure, if he did not work unbelievably hard, we would not have got that piece of information. And that information, where McCord saying he was pressured, he was hired by somebody, is now going to lead to the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate is going to be like, something's going on. And of course, the U.S. Senate is dominated by Democrats. So they launched their own investigation. Now, this is a bunch of politicians launching an investigation, trying to figure out what is going on with this Watergate nonsense. So this is really the beginning of the end, because you now have an organization with power trying to figure some things out. So Richard Nixon is massively paranoid that he's going to be brought down. Remember, that whole cancer is growing. People are going to rat. So he needs a scapegoat. He needs somebody to blame that's going to provide him protection. So this is a little speculative, never confirmed, but John Dean could be the guy, because John Dean absolutely was managing the Watergate crisis for him. So either way, John Dean meets with Nixon at this point, paranoid Nixon, and Dean felt that he was being recorded, that Richard Nixon was talking to him in a way that he was trying to get Dean to admit to doing all the wrong doing, and that Nixon didn't know anything about it. So that Dean's a smart guy. He's a lawyer. He's like, I'm not going to be the scapegoat here. So Dean, at this point, betrays his loyalties to Nixon and kind of runs away. And on April 6, 1973, after setting it up, he testifies before the Senate committee. And what does he testify about? Well, he says Nixon was part of the cover-up. Nixon is known for like ever that he's had at least 35 conversations about Nixon about covering up the Watergate situation. Nixon is angry. He feels betrayed. And on April 30th, 1973, Nixon goes on television and says, I'm innocent. I am absolutely innocent. John Dean is lying. He's trying to cover his own butt. So at this point, Nixon is again looking for scapegoats. So he fires his chief of staff and his top aide, Haldeman and Ehrlichman. These are the two guys who've been the most loyal to him. But he tells them, listen, you guys have had involvement in this, and you're probably going to get in trouble at some point, but I will pardon you so that you can go free, I promise. So either way, the cover-up to cover up the cover-up is now begun, sort of. And America's looking at this like, I wonder if Nixon's involved. But most Americans don't think so, but maybe they're not convinced. So who to believe? Do we believe Dean or do we believe Nixon? I mean, we love Nixon. He was very popular. He was a good president at the time. So May 18th, 1973, and now, remember, the Senate was already investigating this, but now the Justice Department, these are the experts. These are the real police, the real investigators, the FBI. These are the people that now say, we're going to find out if illegal activity happened here. So now, normally, the Justice Department technically works for Nixon. He's in charge of all of them. He's the boss. He could fire anybody. So they pick an independent counsel, essentially, to investigate Watergate that doesn't answer directly to the Justice Department, so he can be neutral. Guy by the name of Archibald Cox. And he's going to do his own investigation, and he's better than the Senate, so he's really going to dig out some things. But of course, he's wondering, as well as most of America, what did the president know and when did he know it? Dean says he knew it the whole time. So John Dean's testimony, it was a long one, but somewhere in the middle of that, John Dean said, I felt like I was being recorded in the White House. And we already talked about that. But nobody really paid much attention to that until people were like, wait a minute, maybe he was being recorded. Maybe there are listening devices in the White House. Wouldn't that be amazing if there was? On July 13th, 1973, the Senate called in a White House aide named Alexander Butterfield. Alexander Butterfield worked there full time. In fact, one of his jobs was to switch the tapes of the recording system. And in front of the Senate, he says, yep, I'm sad that you asked me that question. I've been trying to keep it secret. But since you asked me, I have to tell the truth. I'm under oath. There is listening devices in the White House. So Kennedy had done it first, and then Nixon basically ripped everything out, but changed his mind and said, you know what, for posterity, for the American people, for the history books, let's keep these listening devices. He actually made a bigger system than Kennedy had. All the phones and then all the areas where people would talk. Nixon was paranoid. He thought people were going to make up lies about him. So he wanted to tape everything so they could prove that other people were lying. He also wanted them for his memoirs afterwards. So either way, there he sets up the taping system, and there's microphones everywhere. You can even see where they were, right around his desk. So what did the president know, and when did he know it? Well, Archibald Cox, special prosecutor for the Justice Department, says, well, give me those tapes. And he issues a subpoena to Nixon. And a subpoena is a court order that you have to follow, or otherwise you'd go to prison. Nixon says, no, I'm not giving you my tapes. These are my tapes. But Nixon's reputation is starting to go down. He has a chance to prove that he's innocent, yet he's hiding the tapes. So September 1973, he keeps telling Cox, stop subpoenaing me. I'm the president of the United States. I haven't done anything wrong. You're making me look bad. Drop it. But either way, Cox says no, and he keeps offering the subpoena and keeps threatening legal action against Nixon. So it's a battle between them. Well, on October 20th, 1973, Nixon has had enough of this little war. And he tells the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to basically fire him, get rid of him, because technically, even though it's an independent investigation, the Attorney General is still in charge of the special prosecutor. So fire him. And of course, Elliot Richardson says, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to fire him. He's finding out that you're probably guilty. So then when you fire the Attorney General, the deputy guy comes up, and that's this dude. And so Nixon tells him, fire him. And he says no, and he quits his job too. So he essentially gets fired. And then Robert Bork, the third guy, takes over as Attorney General, fire him. And Robert Bork actually fires Cox. This will be a controversial move later in his career. That said, this is known as the Saturday Night Massacre, people getting just fired. A lot of times massacres is a nickname for a cleaning of house when lots of people at a workplace are fired, often the connotation of it being a negative thing. So anyway, the first time most Americans thought Nixon was guilty was now. He acted guilty. He was covering things up. So not so good for him. And of course, that's the most famous line, right? I'm not a crook, that Nixon says. So the subpoenas are still out there, whether the guy got fired or not, right? And Nixon continues to say, I will not do this. I'm definitely not going to give you the tapes. And we'll find out why in a minute. He claims executive privilege. Now, executive privilege is a complicated legal term. It's not mentioned in the Constitution, but what it is basically a president can say, no, my staff, my people in the White House don't have to testify in trial against me or about anything or in front of Congress because for two reasons. Number one, checks and balances, separation of powers. If Congress at any time can demand information from the president and his people, they can get too powerful. They can blackmail the president. They can leverage against them. So that's one of the reasons why presidents get to keep these things secret. But number two, the major reason that you could claim executive privilege is this: that if staff members that work for the president that are absolutely vital in creating national policy think they could be sued at any moment for something they said, or put on trial or locked away for things they said, they wouldn't be willing to say controversial things or stick their necks out. They have to be able to offer advice to the president. So presidents have to be able to say, you can't have these people testify about what they've said. And that's executive privilege, and it is a very valid thing. So anyway, he says, I'm not giving these tapes up. This is private things that happen at the White House, private conversations, and no, you can't have them. So April 30th, 1974 comes, and Nixon says, I'll compromise though. I have listened to all the tapes and I've written them up. I've transcribed them. You can have that. And this is them carrying all of those pieces of paper to Congress so Congress can look at them. Now, the problem, though, is with these edited transcripts is they're edited. The material's been redacted, like national security stuff. So you can't see everything. And how do you know if Nixon is just covering important information up and lying? We don't. Problem number two with the transcripts is it revealed Nixon was swearing a massive amount, and that made him look bad and awful. Problem number three, Nixon, with all these White House tapes, looked paranoid, always thinking people were out to get him. And that made him look weak, but he also looked vindictive. He hated so many people in America. And that seemed very unpresidential. People seemed out to get him. Number four, and this was the important part, when he released the transcripts, it indicated that there was an 18 and a half minute gap, that 18 and a half minutes have been erased. There was no transcript for them. Now, this might have been when the president was sleeping, but it wasn't actually. It was during a very pivotal time when Richard Nixon first would have heard about Watergate. Clearly a time where he would have spoken in some controversial or illegal way, but it was coincidentally erased. So 18 and a half minute gap is going to be ultimately this guy's got to be guilty. But let's explain. Nixon says, no, I didn't erase this on purpose. I promise. My secretary, Rosemary Woods, she was transcribing the tapes, listening to them and typing them up. And then the phone rang. And what happened was when the phone rang, she accidentally stepped on the button by her foot that would erase the tape rather than moving it forward, which it was supposed to do. Now, why did her foot bump up against that? Well, basically because when she went to answer the phone, she turned her body, and that's when it tapped against the button. So that said, that's the 18 and a half minute gap. Now, this is called the Rosemary stretch because for her to actually have done that, she would have had to talk on the phone, and the phone was all the way on the other side while keeping her foot pushed against a button. And it basically seemed impossible. There's no way for 18 and a half minutes that anybody would have been able to hold that stance. So here they are, her demonstrating that, no, I can do that. I can talk on the phone while reaching over here and keeping my foot on the button. Virtually impossible. And also, her phone call was only for 5 minutes. The 18 and a half minute stretch was much longer than that. So it doesn't add up at all. She is lying. I can't say with 100% certainty. But also, the FBI later looked at these, and that part of the tape was erased 5 to 9 times to make sure nobody could recover it or click undo, so to speak. So July 24th, 1974, the Supreme Court finally hears the case, U.S. versus Nixon, where Nixon says, executive privilege, I don't have to give up these tapes. So an executive privilege gets shot down by the Supreme Court 8-0. Now, they didn't say executive privilege didn't exist. They said, in times of national security, presidents and their staff have to be able to keep their conversations quiet. And that would be more important than just a Watergate criminal trial. So, yeah, no, you could claim executive privilege if this was national security, but it's not. This is about presidential privacy and whatnot. And the Watergate criminal trial, which might involve the president, definitely trumps you being quiet about things that are happening. So executive privilege does exist. It just doesn't exist in this circumstance. So July 30th, 1974, Nixon has lost. The Supreme Court has told him what to do, release those tapes. And Nixon says, fine, I'll release the tapes. Now, a lot of people say he should have just burned these tapes before he got ordered to send them over, before that Supreme Court case. But he didn't, and maybe he should have. But at this point, the whole country is now listening to these tapes, including the Senate and including the special prosecutors of the Justice Department. Now, what are the conversations they hear? Well, first conversation, on August 1st, 1972, H.R. Haldeman, that's the chief of staff of Nixon, has a conversation with Nixon, and Nixon can be heard saying, well, they have to be paid. That's all there is to it. Pay those burglars. And that demonstrates, of course, obstruction of justice and whatnot, bribery, and that's a high crime. Number two, second conversation on March 21st, 1973. John Dean is talking with Nixon, and this is the famous Cancer in the White House speech, and where he says, Howard Hunt is blackmailing us by demanding money to keep quiet about these break-ins. And Nixon has basically said, yeah, don't you have to handle Hunt's financial situation damn soon? Pay him quick. Pay him that $1 million. And again, obstruction of justice, right? Third conversation, and this is the famous smoking gun conversation. On June 23rd, 1972, H.R. Haldeman, again, chief of staff, is talking with the president. And he's basically saying the FBI has uncovered the check that was written to one of the burglars, and so on. So the FBI is basically going to find a path straight to the White House. So that's literally the check, right? So what Nixon and Haldeman come up with is, why don't we have the CIA contact the FBI and tell them, listen, you got to stop investigating this. There's a lot of CIA stuff that went on. And if you keep investigating, you're going to reveal a lot of our dirty secrets, and that's going to put our national security at risk. So please stay the hell out of this. FBI, back down. And again, the exact quote on the tape was, the way to handle this now is for us to have the CIA and Pat Gray just say, stay the hell out of this. This is a business we don't want you to get further into. Basically pretend that this is massively secret CIA stuff. Stay out of it. So anyway, that's obstruction of justice, basically stopping a criminal investigation. That's a smoking gun. So the smoking gun is a metaphor. The idea is you never really, really, really know if somebody's guilty unless you see them standing over a dead body with a gun smoking, because you know then that they fired it. And these are the smoking gun tapes. This is literal evidence of his guilt, Nixon's guilt. So on August 8th, 1974, now Nixon's own lawyer has announced the president has lied to the nation, to his closest aides and to his own lawyers for more than 2 years. We quit. And at this point, the Republicans that have been protecting Nixon join the Democrats in wanting impeachment. Now, you got to understand, impeachment is putting the president on trial. You have the trial to see if he's guilty. The Senate then votes on if he's guilty, then removes him from office. Now that he's an ordinary citizen, he can be arrested. So Barry Goldwater, basically Nixon's mentor, comes to the White House from the Senate and says, listen, you don't have the support of Congress anymore. You don't. You just lost him with the smoking gun tape. They know you've done criminal things, and now even the Republicans will vote to impeach. And when they impeach, you'll lose the trial in the Senate. So you're done. And so what does Nixon do? He thinks about it, gets a little depressed, and then basically is getting ready to resign. So 3 articles of impeachment are proposed. They're not passed yet. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and then contempt of Congress. Now, obstruction of justice was telling the CIA to tell the FBI not to investigate. Abuse of power was the Dirty Tricks campaign, where Nixon was discovered to use the IRS to audit his enemies and to use the FBI to do illegal wiretaps. And contempt of Congress was not turning over the tapes when he was subpoenaed to do so. So that said, not so good. So here's Nixon. Vice President Ford will take over. And that was them walking to the helicopter. What a really sad time for Nixon. There's Ford and their wives walking away. Sure, they're on the verge of tears. Here's that same time Nixon's about to. That was Nixon saying goodbye. He got into Marine One. He's going to fly over the White House. Ford's going to go back in the White House, get sworn in, become our next president. Now, President Ford now is President Ford. Now, major questions about the Watergate, crisis. Was Nixon behind the Watergate break-in? He was not. June 23rd, 1972, tape. Nixon basically said, "Who's the jerk that did this?" So he didn't know. That was authentic. Was the break-in of Watergate really even needed? And the answer was maybe, but probably not, because he crushed George McGovern in the '72 election. Creep did not have to be this active. I mean, Nixon won all of these states except Massachusetts. I think it's like the biggest landslide ever. Who was Deep Throat? The guy giving Woodward and Bernstein all that information that kept this going. And the answer was 33 years later, the person was revealed. It wasn't supposed to be revealed until he died, but he came out on his own. Mark Felt came out in his last days prior to dying, saying, "It was me. It was me. I'm the guy that took down Nixon. I'm the guy that fed all that information to Woodward and Bernstein." Now, was anybody ever arrested? Oh, by the way, Mark Felt was the number 2 guy at the FBI. He was supposed to become the head of the FBI when Hoover died, J. Edgar Hoover, but he got passed over by Nixon for somebody else, a crony of Nixon. So he was resentful. He's like, "Nixon's doing all these sketchy things, and he passed me over for the job. All right, I'm going to rat him out." Now, was anybody ever arrested? Yeah, 68 people were charged with crimes part of the Nixon administration. 48 members were convicted, and it was either 42 or 48 went to prison. Now, was Nixon ever arrested? Well, you can't be arrested as president, but on September 8th, 1974, when he was about to get arrested, what happened? And the answer is hopefully this. Well, apparently that did not happen. Based Gerald Ford, President Ford is going to announce a full pardon for anything Nixon might have done. Now, did Nixon ever apologize? That was really big. He now has a pardon. He got away with it. He committed all these crimes. He didn't go to jail. 48 other people went to jail. It's not okay. Did he ever apologize? This was very important, people. And years later, Nixon's going to be interviewed by this guy named Frost. And this is what Nixon said. So that's the first piece he said. He let down everybody. I mean, that's an apology. At the very beginning, he said, "I'm sorry," but that was a little more effective. So the largest impact of Watergate, trust. Americans have not felt the same about government ever since, and I don't think they ever will. A lot of people used to grow up saying, "I want to be president," and then that's going to kind of go away and whatnot. So that said, that was the Watergate story, and hopefully we learned a little bit about it. And thank you so much for sticking with us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.